Good evening, everyone. I'm Laura Sparks, president of the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art, and I'm so glad to welcome you here this evening. As you may know, the Cooper Union is among the nation's leading colleges for students pursuing degrees in architecture, art, and engineering. And since our founding, this institution has also stood as a public forum where individuals amplify calls for social justice, debate timely issues, and participate in the shaping of our society and our shared human experience. We continue in that tradition tonight with what I know will be an important and thought-provoking discussion. Tonight's program has actually been several months in the making. In late January, we were to open an exhibition of work by students in the Irwin S. Channon School of Architecture here at Cooper. These students had embarked 3 years prior on a project unearthing the little-known history of Hutamas, a progressive interdisciplinary Soviet design school in the 1920s that aimed to make a design education accessible to all and was closed under Stalin's regime a decade later. The exhibition was originally scheduled to be publicly presented in the fall of 2021, but the pandemic was still a factor, so the exhibition was delayed, and the ultimate announcement of in January of its opening in a world that looked very different than it did in 2021 prompted important questions and concerns, particularly given Russia's war against Ukraine. Our community and the world have watched in horror, outrage, and shared grief at the Russian Federation's ongoing brutal invasion of Ukraine. The atrocities of the war are devastating. That's particularly true for the people who have made their lives and livelihoods in Little Ukraine and throughout New York City, and it's also true for many in our Cooper Union community with Ukrainian roots. Since the late 19th century, this East Village enclave has been a vibrant home for Ukrainian culture, art, architecture, commerce, and family life. I want to thank our partners for tonight's program, the Shevchenko Scientific Society and the Ukrainian Museum. These are two of the long-standing organizations that have shaped our neighborhood and contributed to the richness of Ukraine's presence in both New York and in the nation. So when in January, divergent views and deep concerns about the exhibition emerged, we postponed the opening to listen and to engage with one another, with scholars here at Cooper and elsewhere, with our faculty, our staff, our students, and with our neighbors. We explored questions about how the historical study of art and architecture could be used to advance current political agendas, how the design of then new tools could have been instrumentalized later for political gain, how romanticization of historical periods runs the risk of obscuring these possibilities, and whether scholarly study of 100-year-old pedagogy can stand apart from geopolitical events then or now. Over the last several months, we've done critical work, in part to further situate the exhibition, which opened earlier this week, and in larger part to push ourselves to learn, to better understand these complexities, and to engage the public in issues that are critical to address our shared work toward a more just society. Tonight, this work, this conversation continues. The Cooper Union has always been a public forum for meaningful, honest, and holistic investigation, debate, dialogue, and learning from what history can teach us in the pursuit of a just and peaceful society. We are as committed as ever to upholding that ideal. So thank you for being here tonight for our exploration of war-art balance. And to the people of Ukraine and all who call for an end to this senseless war, we stand in solidarity with you. Now, please join me in welcoming my colleague, the Cooper Union's Associate Dean of the School of Art, Adriana Farmiga.
Good evening. My name is Adriana Farmiga, and in addition to being an artist, I'm the Associate Dean and faculty member in sculpture in the School of Art here at the Cooper Union. I'm a proud alumna of this institution and also have a lifetime membership in the Ukrainian diaspora. So following up from President Sparks's introduction, I'd like to extend a personal welcome to everyone in attendance tonight in Ukrainian. Добрий вечір, шановні гості. Ще раз дякуємо всім за те, що ви приєдналися до нас сьогодні, щоб взяти участь у цій важливій розмові. Ця зустріч є наслідком співпраці і зусиль наших шкіл та громадських установ. Ось і цей великий зал, в якому ми сьогодні знаходимося, завжди був місцем свободи слова та відкритого діалогу, місцем для участі в складних, цікавих та захоплюючих дискусіях, які сприяють розвитку суспільства. Відкритий діалог і критичне мислення лежать в основі цієї установи як в буквальному та ідеологічному значенні. Ми завжди готові вислухати і висловити різні погляди, які відповідають більшій меті, до якої ми прагнемо. І сьогоднішній вечір не виняток. Щоб допомогти поміркувати, обґрунтувати і чіткіше окреслити нашу розмову цього вечора, я хочу вам представити доктора Олега Коцюбу. Він щедро присвятив багато часу, знань і зусиль, щоб уможливити цей вечір. Олег Коцюба – літературознавець, культуролог, керівник видань Українського дослідницького інституту при Гарвардському університеті та директор проєкту української бази даних з першоджерел для вивчення України «Україника». Він також є головним онлайн-редактором провідного українського інтелектуального журналу «Критика». And now I will toggle back to English. To help moderate and frame our conversation this evening, I would like to introduce Dr. Oleg Kotyuba, who has been extremely generous with his time and knowledge in making this event possible. Dr. Kotyuba is a scholar of literature and culture, manager of publications at Harvard University's Ukrainian Research Institute, and director of the Ukrainica database project on primary sources for the study of Ukraine. He is also the chief online editor at Kritika, a leading Ukrainian intellectual journal. With that, please join me in welcoming Oleg, who will in turn introduce the other participants. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this generous presentation and for the introduction, and thank you to everyone for attending this conversation tonight. I have to start with full disclosure. I'm Ukrainian. I was born and raised in Ternopil, in the city of Ternopil in Ukraine, where I also went to college before making my way to Germany, and then eventually to the United States for my graduate education. And in that way, I obviously follow a path, although for other reasons, that many of those Ukrainians who live in the United States today have also followed. This conversation hits very close to home for me, also because part of my family lives in the south of Ukraine, in Mykolaiv and now also in Odessa, that have been under heavy shelling from the Russian troops. As Ukrainians, we are used to being marginalized, we're used to being dismissed or reduced to broad stereotypes. And so this event, supported by this institution and this important conversation, is a first on so many levels. So thank you very much for doing this. The event is titled War Art Balance. And what does that actually mean? The title itself comes from Ukraine, where the actual version of this is war-life balance. And it's a complicated phenomenon, and it's a complicated question to ask ourselves. Is the art of the early 20th century and Russia's brutal war on Ukraine today unconnected? The image that we chose for today's conversation displays, if we could perhaps have it on the central screen, displays the building of the Zaliznychnik, or the railwayman culture in Kharkiv. Considered his most important work, This constructivist building of the palace was designed by Alexander Dmitriev to echo the iconic Держпром building close by on the square. Built in 1927 to 1932, the palace was destroyed by Russian missiles on August 18, 2022. And so when we ask the questions about whether or not art from 100 years ago and our study of it today have any relation to what is happening in the world as we speak, that is one of the examples of what that kind of connection could look like. And of course, all of us, or many of us, have the desire to return to quote-unquote business as usual, to doing life stuff, so to speak, rather than war stuff. And Ukrainians who perhaps desire that the most, they don't have the choice. And so when we speak about the war-life balance, that balance doesn't exist for Ukrainians, and we need to acknowledge that today, and I hope we'll do that today as well. Our conversation tonight is not about the Vkhutemas exhibition itself, but about the politics of knowledge, education, and art at a time when people in Ukraine, including artists and scholars, are being put in filtration and torture camps, executed with their hands tied behind their backs, raped and mutilated. At such a time, can we return to that business as usual? Can we not take a position in regards to what is happening in Ukraine in our work here? Yes, we can, and many have done just that, but what does such a stance of quote-unquote not taking a position actually mean? As we know from history, many individuals and institutions avoided taking a position in the events leading up to World War II, and we know in what kind of horrible tragedy it all ended. The Cooper Union had the courage to take a position, and a deeply ethical, in my view, position at that, in order to make today's conversation possible. And I would like to express my deep gratitude to them for that. Thank you. Because a decision about postponing, and that deserves to be emphasized, that is not canceled, not destroyed, shelled, bombed out of existence, but to postpone an art event is not about cancel culture, quote-unquote, or quote-unquote censorship in relation to Russian art culture and its study. Nothing, really nothing, endangers Russian art today, but Ukrainian artists are the ones losing their lives, their homes, their artworks, their ability to create without fear today. Against this background, the decision to postpone an exhibition of student works is one of solidarity with the suffering of people in Ukraine today. Because business as usual that ignores the brutality of what Russia is doing to Ukrainian civilians today cannot be ignored for someone with a sense of what is right and what is wrong. I invite my friends and colleagues, students and instructors in the fields of history, the arts, and Slavic studies more broadly, to consider the consequences of their own decision not to take a stance, or to take one that is merely declarative, without any real change to what they teach and research, and how they go about teaching and research today. Now, the conversation we're about to have is, I hope, but a start in what hopefully will be a series of discussions about how we can step outside the framework that has been in place for many decades in approaching quote-unquote central and quote-unquote peripheral art and artists in Eastern Europe and Russia. As such, this will not be a conversation about the Vkhutemas exhibition itself, co-curated by Anna Bokov and Stephen Hillier, and featuring works by former and current Cooper Union students, reproducing the works of several Vkhutemas students. That exhibition, as was mentioned earlier, is currently on display on the second floor of this building, and I hope that you were able to go and see it, or that you will do so after this event. Please make your own judgment on what the exhibit includes and what it leaves out. Our conversation today will be about the role that art plays in societies as they go through complex and violent events, about co-opting art for political purposes in order to cover up or distract from violence being inflicted on innocent people. This conversation will also be about the context in which art was and is being created, because the parallels between the early 20th century and today are both obvious and striking to those who are aware of the history of the region of Eastern Europe, Ukraine, and Russia. Finally, we will be talking about the consequences of placing all things Russian at the center of our study of the region and the artistic phenomena that came out of it. Because the decisions we make about what we consider, again, quote-unquote, important and quote-unquote central in our work and teaching have far-reaching consequences for generations of students and scholars who often perpetuate the very approaches they're obligated to question and revise as scholars and practitioners. To all those attending our events today, especially current students of the Cooper Union, I would like to emphasize the relevance of today's conversation to you personally. I believe it's very real. Not only in terms of your own ethical decisions going forward, but also in practical terms. There will be unprecedented and exciting opportunities in Ukraine for people like you once the war is over. Because all those whole cities that Putin's army and private mercenaries are leveling in Ukraine today as we speak will have to be rebuilt when Ukraine is victorious. And they will have to be rebuilt better, more beautiful, and more functional for life in the 21st century than they were before the war. Brilliant careers of many of you are likely to be made in Ukraine, and if you would like to take advantage of those opportunities, you need to be aware of the complex issues that we will be talking about today. Vladimir Putin made the mistake of believing that Ukrainians and Russians are one and the same, that there will be no popular resistance, and that he will take Ukraine in 3 days. Many in the West believe the same, often schooled by people who presented the entire region to them as fully Russia-centered. Please do not make the same mistake. Once again, I would like to stress that this is only a beginning of a series of discussions about these issues that I hope will continue. We have very little time today and won't be able to talk about everything in great detail or to engage in a lot of questions and answers. But that only means that more conversations and more exchanges will be necessary in the future in order to reform a system that has been in place for far too long. I believe it's only appropriate for that to start with a Ukrainian voice. And so it is my pleasure today to invite Tatiana Filevska to open with her remarks. Tatiana Filevska is a specialist in the field of contemporary art, curation, and writing, and is currently the creative director of the Ukrainian Institute in Kyiv. Her published books include Kazimir Malevich, The Kyiv Period, 1928-1930, and Dmytro Gorbachev, Случаи. She graduated with honors from the Faculty of Philosophy of the Taras Shevchenko National University in Kyiv and is a graduate of the Flex Exchange Program. She has previously worked at the Eidos Foundation Center for Contemporary Art, the Center for Contemporary Art Foundation, and Izolyatsiya, Platform for Cultural Initiatives, where she also curated the public program for the Ukrainian Pavilion at the 59th Venice Biennale, dedicated to decolonization. Please.
Thank you so much, Oleg, for introducing me, and give me a second to share my screen. So thank you again for inviting me, and it's a privilege to be part of this really important event and conversation.
As is usual with such events, sometimes there are some technical hiccups, so let's just take our moment to figure them out, and then we can continue.
Continue with the live presentation while we fix our technical problems.
Okay. Okay, perhaps we'll continue with Miroslava Mudrak for now, and then we will return back to Tatiana Filevska to continue with her presentation. So let me take this opportunity to present Miroslava Mudrak. Miroslava Maria Mudrak is Professor Emerita of the History of Art at The Ohio State University. She specializes in the field of modernist art of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Her scholarly interests focus on Eastern Europe, Ukraine, Russia, and the former Soviet Union in relation to the philosophical and stylistic developments of the West. For more than 3 decades, she taught at The Ohio State University and lectured on the ideological discourses, socio-political influences, and artistic practice within East European cultures that use modernity to signify national identity. Her seminal work, New Generation of Artistic Modernism in Ukraine, was awarded the Kovalev Prize for Ukrainian Studies and was published in a Ukrainian translation in 2018. In 2020, she was elected as a foreign member to the National Academy of Arts of Ukraine, and she is a full member of the Shevchenko Scientific Society of America, which is a partner of this event.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. I was hoping that some of the introductory material would be covered by my colleagues, so I'll have to make some comments just to get you into the material because of the technical difficulties. I titled my talk 1922 to 2022, Constructivism at Risk Again, because I feel that we're at a moment when looking at the exhibition of, really a wonderful exhibition here at Cooper Union, of the work of students at Frutemas, kind of recreated by the students at Cooper Union. We understand what a wonderful movement this was, what a visionary movement this was, called constructivism. Yes, it was born out of the revolution, it was born out of the fall of the empire, it was born out of utopian dreams, possibilities, seemingly limitless possibilities, but it wasn't only in Russia. And so my point is to think about how Russian history is presented, how we think about all the nations that were once either part of the empire or later part of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, how they all get lumped together under the rubric of Russian. And just as an example of why this is important to bear in mind in this day and age, especially in light of the war, is that there were many things happening outside of Moscow and outside of St. Petersburg. We often hear the contextualization of center and periphery. It already sets up a kind of higher and lower mode of existence or artistic creation. And unfortunately, Ukrainian art, or Georgian art, or Azerbaijani art, or Lithuanian art, or Latvian art, in light of either the Soviet Union or those who had been subjugated under the Russian Empire, they are always given kind of secondary status. And the centers of Moscow, St. Petersburg, are always the centers of culture. There's a lot to be said about that, but I'd like us to begin to think about what was happening outside of those centers that bears witnessing, that bears our own consideration. So let me begin by showing you a beautiful building, a constructivist building, which actually was built. And here's a difference between the Frutemas projects and this building, which is referred to as the Держпром, which is located in Kharkiv. And I'm almost fearful to talk about it because it has not been destroyed. It has not been bombed. Just to save time, I'll just read you some information on this building, because especially for the architecture students here at Cooper Union, it might be of great interest. The Держпром, and it comes from the Ukrainian language, Derj meaning, it's a shortened kind of neologism for state. Prom is from promysl, state industry. So it's the state industry building. It is, in fact, the largest architectural structure built in the constructivist manner in the entire world. It was begun in 1925. It was completed in 1929. Its architect, Sergei Serafimov, who was a Russian academic architect and who was a teacher at the Svomas, the free art studios that preceded the Vchutemas, and two other architects, Mark Felger and Samuel Kravets, the latter born in Lithuania but lived in Ukraine, the other from Odessa. So there's an internationalism that bears taking note of as we think about constructivist projects like this one. For those interested in its layout, it consists of 9 buildings grouped together in 3 blocks, and each of the blocks have 3 units in it. The longitudinal axes of the individual buildings are oriented radially to converge on the center of a round space, forming the effect of a fan-shaped composition. And they essentially form an arc, kind of the outer arc of an entire circle, which is called Freedom Square today in Kharkiv. The streets radiating from the center are determine the entire urban composition for central Kharkiv. Since we know that at Vchutemas, spatial orientation, spatial creation was really one of the key pedagogic elements, this building really demonstrates how that came into being and how it actually works in an actual structure. Bridges create passageways spanning the streets at the 3rd, the 5th, and the 6th story levels, connecting the central block with the side units. 4 big courts and 16 small courts form an unusual interior in the open air, a plein air court, if you will, or sometimes it's called the Court of Honor. Like the Weimar Bauhaus, but also different, the outer space of the city is directly integrated in the composition. You could walk through underneath the building. 2 streets behind it, the Henri Barbus Street and the Romain Rolland Street, pierce through the building and emerge into the round public sphere. What really makes Держпром in Kharkiv is the series of interconnecting sky bridges between each cluster, shooting across and up as high as 8 stories. The interior shows an interconnected corridor system lit only from one side. A reinforced concrete carcass of multi-story frames has 1,500 doors and 4,500 windows. Now, as we think about Vchutemas and its relation to the avant-garde, whether it be the Russian avant-garde or the Ukrainian avant-garde, there are some considerations that are worth noting as well in the Держпром building. It is constructed of new materials. It is a new conception of space. It demonstrates efficiency. It shows unanticipated perspectives. It's based on the principle of cinematographic montage. And the shining facets of glazed volumes make for a kaleidoscope of shifting patterns on the interior. It is considered to be the first complex of skyscrapers in Europe, or the combination of skyscrapers. And I'll quote here, a minimal, unpretentious modern idiom modeled more on the style of the glassy daylight factories of Detroit and the interconnected skyscrapers of Chicago than on Le Corbusier or the Bauhaus. What was its purpose? It was designed to house the central government, the administrative and economic offices of the government. There were 2 auditoria, provided for public use. One had 1,000 seats, one had 250 seats. It also housed a technical library of 250,000 volumes, a reading hall, and 200-seat dining hall. So I'll show you a few images now that you've an aerial image here, which gives you a sense of the spaciousness and the prominence of this structure. And really, it's prominent yet unassuming, and that's one of the characteristics of constructivism, that it demonstrates a rational functionalism that fits within an urban environment. The ground plan gives you some evidence of some of the things that I was talking about, the interconnectedness between the units, again with active pedestrians crossing Freedom Square here, and a kind of a radial positioning of the Держпром within the city square. And if you look up, I was talking about these courts of honor, these aerial courts of honor, just a beautiful vignette of abstract form that emerges. Two other pictures. One, the radio tower was added later. And here I'd just like to point out that it was partially destroyed when the Germans came into Kharkiv, and they left a little bit of damage, but it was rebuilt. Part of that rebuilding, I'm afraid, has cost it its position as a UNESCO preserved site. There was some painting that was done, and there was some replacement of windows that were done that doesn't allow it to be placed on that list, although there are attempts to continue that process. On the opposite side of Держпром, on the opposite side of this Svoboda Square, or Square of Freedom, is a building that you might recognize from the first days of the war, and it is the central government building and city hall of Kharkiv that was damaged 6 days into the war. Artillery shells damaged the right side of the building that you see, and I'm showing you the building on the bottom there. So, the fact that Держпром has not been damaged is kind of a provocative question overall. Already Oleg mentioned the Railway Workers' Palace, which serves as kind of the backdrop for the announcement for this event. It too was built in this constructivist manner, but in an interesting way in that it also radiates, but in the opposite way, into the city square. It's where several busy streets come together. It is unfortunate. Here's the ground plan for it, so you can see how it's laid out. And it's unfortunate that it was damaged. I had the opportunity to walk through the building and really observe it. It has so many interesting features, architectural features, that are highlighted by the windows that bring in light and then create moments of visual interest throughout the structure. But I want to move on, using constructivism as a backdrop, I want to move on to one of the critical issues which I think might be a topic for discussion today. Here you see the rubric Russian constructivism. And this rubric is problematic because here we see Tatlin's Tower. For those who have studied the Russian avant-garde, it's a known artwork and project. But here I'm showing you a book that many of you have probably used in your classes, The Russian Experiment in Art. It is the textbook that everybody starts their Russian culture classes with, especially of the modern period. On the cover of Camilla Gray's book is a portrait of Tatlin himself. But what most people fail to note is that Tatlin comes from Kharkiv, from the Kharkiv region. And Kharkiv was an industrial region. And Tatlin was also a musician, and he played the Ukrainian national instrument, which is the bandura, a stringed instrument. And by playing the stringed instrument, he was able to take a trip to Berlin with a capella of the bandura players. And from there, he went to Paris, where he visited Picasso. At the time, this was 1913, Picasso was beginning his relief constructions. So there's a real connectivity between this one man, Tatlin, his Ukrainian context, the way that he came to learn about modernism, and the way that his Ukrainian background actually allowed him to find passage to the capital of modernity in Paris. But I want to bring out one other point. When we think about Tatlin's tower, and people have reconstructed it, people have rebuilt it, people have studied it, there are very few documents that are associated with it. But one of the aspects of research that never seems to enter into a consideration of it is this stringed instrument, the bandura. And I think as art historians, it's incumbent on us to understand visual form and how visual form and materiality, especially as it relates to constructivism, are intertwined to create new objects with a new vision for utility. And so when we think about either Tatlin's tower, with its kind of bare kind of spine and lathe work, or if we think of his later project, the Le Tatlin, the plane, revealing essentially just rib work, it's hard not to think about Tatlin playing this instrument, very sonorous, very open, touching every string. So it's just a consideration that I kind of put out there, hoping that we can expand our understanding of these developments without putting it all into one single narrow classification for which Russia gets credit. Tatlin as well was a designer, and he designed this cover for a collection of poetry in Kharkiv, so his connection with the Ukrainian elite was very direct. Perhaps I'll stop here. I have other examples to show, but maybe there will be an opportunity after we have a discussion or something to show you other examples. I need to make time for my colleagues. Thank you very much for your attention.
Oleg, we're ready for Tatiana.
Thank you very much, and let me first of all thank Miroslava Mudrak for her insightful remarks, and already we can see how much new we're learning today, and I hope we get to discuss it more. And now we're happy to turn to Tatiana Filevska, again, who is an art historian and curator, and currently the creative director of the Ukrainian Institute in Kyiv. Thank you.
So thank you again for inviting me. It's a privilege to be part of this important event. And we are here because of the discussion around the exhibition in the Cooper Union. And it was not so much the content of the exhibition itself, but the fact that the topic refers to Russian avant-garde. And frankly, there is nothing new in the interest in Russian avant-garde in the world, but it was the beginning of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine that the exhibition was supposed to open it for the first time. And in this context, we need to find answers to a few questions that I myself would put in this way. What is the context that defines any conversation about Russian art now, and how it changes our perception of this art itself? And what is the appropriate way to work with it? There are, of course, many ways to answer it, but I will share my perspective as a Ukrainian cultural actor and an art historian of avant-garde in Ukraine. And I will share 3 points with you. So first is that we have to be aware that culture and art is always political. Avant-garde artists who studied in Futamas 100 years ago admired the communist ideas and supported the Bolshevik government. Some of them continued even when repression started, and they witnessed how their friends were arrested and murdered by the regime as part of the terror in the Soviet Union. In the past 2 decades, Russian Federation used cultural heritage and avant-garde in particular to bring its agenda into Western institutions. I think you remember a series of the exhibitions dedicated to the centennial of the Bolshevik revolt in Russia that took place in all major world museums. Some of the examples are on the screen. In fact, 1917 was the year when National Liberation Revolution happened in Ukraine and some other countries in the region, which meant that Russian Soviet Republic had to wage a war against the Ukrainian National Republic. And it ended in 1922 when Ukraine was occupied by Soviet Russia. Those Russian exhibitions we mentioned all were about avant-garde, supported by Russian money and followed by positions of experts in Russia incorporated into these museums. Moreover, Russia appropriated art of both Russian Empire and the USSR and branded it all Russian, something that Miroslava just referred to, even if it was from Ukraine or Georgia. So-called Russian avant-garde was often created by artists of multiple nationalities. Just 1 month ago, the Hermitage closed the exhibition titled Russian Avant-Garde, Art for the New World, a year into a full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. The director of Hermitage, who is a friend of Putin and his admirer, admitted in one of his interviews that presentation of Russian art abroad is a kind of special operation of Russia against the West. Special operation, of course, is the war. By the way, the Hermitage takes part in looting Ukrainian museums and illegal archaeological excavations in the occupied Crimea. Art is always political. Support of the so-called Russian avant-garde perfectly meets the goals of the Kremlin. Supporting Russian culture in uncritical way before it is decolonized is supporting Russian imperialism. And sensitivity of the moment calls us to suspend the voice of the aggressor. My second point is about cultural heritage. Russia is waging a neo-colonial genocidal war against the independent European state of Ukraine. One of its targets is art and cultural heritage. They bomb and loot museums, kill Ukrainian artists, and try to eliminate Ukrainians as a nation. And it may be a surprise to many, but it is not for the first time in our history. Ukraine had its own avant-garde 100 years ago. It was a cultural renaissance, but the artists were either physically exterminated and their archives destroyed, or their memory forbidden. We hardly knew anything about it until Ukrainian archives, including those of the KGB, became open to the public about 20 years ago. By the way, in Russia, they never were. On the image, you can see the place in Sandermoh in the north of Russia, where several hundred of Ukrainian artists and writers were killed just in a few days, sometimes 2 with 1 bullet. Russia acts as a terrorist. Its culture cannot continue dominating over the victim of their aggression in the case of Ukraine. It cannot continue to be privileged anymore. But we still see how Russian art attracts much more attention than Ukrainian in major art institutions around the globe. My third point, you look at Futamas as a unique phenomenon of its time, as a Russian Bauhaus, but frankly, it was not the only one. The Kiev Art Institute was another such laboratory of new art in 1924-1930, hardly known about. And that's just one example from the region that we don't talk about today, dedicating our resources to Futamas instead. Meanwhile, there were remarkable artists teaching at the Kiev Art Institute at the same time as Futamas was active. Kryczewski, Boychuk, Bogomazov, Palmov, Golubatnikov, Kramarenko, Tatlin and Malevich, by the way, did too. Tatlin actually worked on his Litatlin in his Kiev apartment, and there are wonderful memories of his students about that. While he was also leading a newly established department for cinema, theater, and photography at the Kiev Art Institute. Malevich had the last attempt to implement his pedagogical ideas into life here in Kiev, and I published an archive that unveils his work in the Institute several years ago. The archive was mostly accidentally discovered just in 2015, and by the way, it's available in English. The work of the Kyiv Art Institute made it to a separate article in a French-speaking magazine La Nervie in 1928, which was dedicated fully to Ukrainian literature, music, and art. But why is there still so little known about it? I want to give you one example to explain. This is Ivan Lipkivsky. He was a close student of Mikhailo Boychuk, who actually established a school of national Ukrainian style and was teaching at the Kyiv Art Institute. Lipkivsky was also teaching and exhibiting a lot and was recognized as one of the most prominent artists of his generation. He was also exhibiting once in the Venice Biennale. His works were even shown at the Venice Biennale. But he was arrested and killed in 1937 together with his teacher and other students of Boychuk, and all of his paintings and archive were destroyed. Basically, you can see on this image everything that we have left. So there are only 3 paintings, 3 sketches, and a few reproductions left, including one from La Nervie. His wife spent decades in labor camps. His son grew up in an orphanage. They were not allowed to live in large cities and get higher education. His grandson, whom I know personally, is the first in 4 generations who was not afraid to learn more about his ancestor. Erased from history because of his choice to be a Ukrainian artist. We are now fighting for justice in all senses, including epistemic justice for artists like Lipkivsky. He has the right to be in our arts history. Russia is not allowed to wipe out the lives of people and whole generations and continue to be celebrated with its great culture in the world. And to conclude, in the case of Ukraine, not only could not subaltern speak, but he, she, or they also could not see, know, or remember. Repression of memory is probably the most violent of all, as it erases identity for the following generations, totally replacing it with imperial identity. Ukrainian soldiers at the front line are now fighting for our right to finally know what our history was and to have the chance to tell the world about it. My position, knowledge, and experience tell me that until Russia is defeated on the front line, until it withdraws all of its troops from Ukrainian territory and Ukraine returns to its borders of 1991, including Crimea, until all the war criminals are taken to the accountability, until Russia pays reparations to Ukraine, until it decolonizes itself and its culture, it is too early to study, exhibit, or admire anything Russian the way we did before. It must be put in the context of the current Russian invasion of Ukraine and the imperial violence Ukraine suffered from Russia for centuries. Russia weaponizes its culture and targets Ukrainian culture. By giving a voice to culture of aggressor and ignoring the voice of the silenced victim, you easily end up at the wrong side of history, even having the purest intentions. Ukrainian writer Oksana Zabushko said, "You can't mourn something you didn't even know existed." A huge community of art professionals mourns now the loss of the chance to enjoy Vkhutemas because they know well its context and its value. At the same time, Ukrainian art is being destroyed because it was not known to the world. Zabushko spoke about our masterpieces, the mosaics of a Ukrainian artist Alla Horska that were destroyed in Mariupol last year. Alla Horska was herself a dissident, and she fought for human rights and was killed by the KGB for that. So let us finally give the voice to those who were silent. The price of the 7 minutes of me talking to you about Ukrainian art is paid by thousands of lives given to fight against Russian aggression. And I will leave you with that.
Thank you very much, dear Tatiana, for this perspective and for also opening up the conversation to larger contexts that perhaps remain, not perhaps, but definitely remain underrepresented today. Let's proceed with our opening remarks. We're slightly behind our time, but it is my pleasure to invite Mayhill Fowler. She is an associate professor in the Department of History at Stetson University. She has published and presented widely on culture in Ukraine, including her book Beaumont on Empire's Edge, State and Stage in Soviet Ukraine. She is currently writing a book on theater women in Ukraine over the 20th century and researching a project about the former Soviet Army theater in Lviv. She was a fellow at the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute and the University of Toronto, and a Fulbright Scholar to Ukraine in 2019-2020. She is an affiliated researcher with the Center for Urban History in Lviv, affiliated faculty in the program in theater studies at Ivan Franko National University, and a full member of the Shevchenko Scientific Society in New York. A former actress, she holds an MFA from the National Theater Conservatory, a BA in Slavic languages from Yale University, and a PhD from Princeton University. Please, I welcome you to start with your remarks.
So thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you, Oleg, for bringing us all together. And thank you for providing the hybrid capabilities. It's the last week of the semester with many on-campus events, and I'm sure it's similar for you at Cooper Union, so thank you. So let me begin with a question. Why do we think certain artistic objects, artists, or institutions are important? What makes Hutemas important and worthy of study? We might answer, it's an institution that created innovative artistic projects, launched careers, inspired students, including Cooper Unions, and continues to inspire. But just pause and think. What else or who else might have been doing that work of inspiration? Where else might it have been happening? I'd like to talk about the geopolitics of knowledge. It's a concept of Walter Mignolo, and we could explore further the dense topic of post-colonialism and decoloniality, but I'd like to explain how what we think is important or worthy of study, worthy of exhibits, scholarly panels, chapters in textbooks, is not objective. It's a product of what critics or states or empires tell us is important. Centers and peripheries are shaped and are generally products of power. Knowledge is connected with geopolitics. And so let me give you an example from my field, theater. So you might have heard of Stanislavski or Meyerhold or the Blue Blouses or the wild experiments in Moscow theaters. It's all true. But there was an equally important event in 1920, in the middle of war, in Bila Tsirkva, a small town south of Kiev, where Les Kurbas and his company performed Macbeth in Ukrainian for the first time ever. Ever. The Russian Empire long restricted Ukrainian printing and performance, and Shakespeare in Ukrainian, not allowed. But here they were in 1920, performing a play about the death of kings. And think, 1920, the collapse of empires, the violent negotiations over the border. In fact, the Poles had just retreated from the area, and the violence that started with World War I in 1914 would continue in this region really until 1922. Kurbas and his team had worked together in Kyiv since 1917, doing experimental work inspired by his training in the Habsburg Empire. The exercises, approaches, and stage techniques would shape Ukrainian theater through the 1930s until his death and even beyond. But no one knows about Bila Tsirkva. Why? Because it is just Ukrainian theater. Theater scholars in the Russian capitals of Moscow and St. Petersburg long considered Moscow and Leningrad, St. Petersburg, the centers, and Ukraine just the periphery. And Western scholars actually reproduced those categories and largely still reproduce them today. Moscow Theater Center, what's happening in Ukraine is just less important. But Bila Tsirkva, for example, is different than Moscow. Its context is different. The violence of war, the different artistic influences, and its consequence is different, the entire trajectory of theater in Ukraine. And it's not lesser, but it's that epistemic violence of empire that simply erases topics from discussion that are outside the purported center. So think about geographies of culture. Why are centers centers and peripheries peripheries? And just maybe we need to question those geographies. centering Ukraine, and see how that changes our picture of why art emerges where it does and when it does. If we did that, we might see Bila Tsirkva and the dynamic of art and violence. We might see wild experimentation like nothing else. The first ever Ukrainian musical, Hello from Radio 477. By the way, Yara Arts Project with Serhii Jadan recently did a new version in New York. Maybe some of you were able to see it. But the original in 1929 made fun of Moscow and of themselves and of artists, and at one point had an actor trapped in a cherry brandy bottle with a line of ducks. It was all about the present, and it was witty and sharp and big and jazzy and amazing. We might see hack plays that become works of art when made by great artists, using techniques similar but different to those in Moscow or Leningrad. We would see multi-ethnicity, so central to culture in Ukraine. The Kulturliga, or Culture League, founded in 1918, a major motor of Yiddish culture, and the trajectory of Yiddish theater, from state theaters to a special division of the theater school in Kiev that trained actors in Yiddish, to a puppet theater in Kiev in Yiddish, which won second place in an all-union competition. Oh, and the only Polish theater in the entire Soviet Union. And we would see what happened when the empire crushed culture in Ukraine, which they did. They murdered artists from Ukraine and erased their art. And it's vanished and remained vanished from any survey course of Russian and Soviet theater. And generally, those of us who study it are considered not to study avant-garde theater in a universal sense, but somehow just Ukrainian theater. That is the geopolitics of knowledge, that we don't know about Kurbas as much as about Meyerhold, that we don't know about the Kiev Art Institute or Berezil as much as Frutemas. So I'll return to Frutemas. It's a center, but it can also be a periphery. So let me introduce you to Antonina Mackiewicz. You probably never heard of her. She went to Frutemas. She was there. But then she came home to Soviet Ukraine. She actually worked with Les Kurbas's theater. You've just met him. Then after the Soviets occupied Western Ukraine, Eastern Poland in 1939, she came to the city of Lviv in 1940 and founded the Puppet Theater. She returned in 1945 after the war to continue her work in puppetry. In fact, the entire world of puppetry in Western Ukraine and really post-war Soviet Ukraine is because of her. Frutemas is but a moment in her life and very long career. And lest you think puppet theaters in Ukraine are peripheral, well, puppet theaters have been doing a lot of humanitarian work with displaced children, work with preserving culture and speaking to the deep need of people in trauma to hear good stories. They are part of the landscape of a society at war and part of the fabric of how Ukraine has resisted and survived and will survive. The Kharkiv Puppet Theater performed in metro stations when the city was being bombed. And recently they began performing in their own theater when Kharkiv is still not safe. They are in a long tradition of puppet theaters in Ukraine. And Frutemas, as a part of Antonina Mackiewicz's story, is in a small way, a peripheral way, part of that larger story of theater in Ukraine. So we can switch center and periphery. Remember, the geography of culture is contingent, it is created, and it is always a product of power. And ultimately, art is about the audience, the society for whom and by whom it is created. And so if we miss the story of art, we actually miss the entire culture of a place. And let's not do that. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for this fantastic presentation, and we'll continue with our opening remarks. And the last of our presenters today to do his opening remarks is Brett Samuels. He is an assistant professor, adjunct in the Irving S. Channing School of Architecture at the Cooper Union, and the founding partner at SITU, an unconventional architecture practice based in New York City that uses design, research, and fabrication for creative and social impact. He is responsible for strategic oversight and directs SITU's research division, which focuses on the intersection of design, human rights, and technology. At SITU Research, Brad is focused on emerging data and design to create new pathways for justice. He has overseen the team's visual investigations for legal and advocacy organizations, including the International Criminal Court, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the Associated Press, Frontline, the United Nations, and many others. In addition, he sits on the Technology Advisory Board for the International Criminal Court, the Advisory Board for the Carnegie Mellon Center for Human Rights Science, the Advisory Board for Dartmouth's Wright Center for the Study of Computation in Just Communities, and the board of the Architectural League of New York. Please.
Just give me a moment while I pull this up. Okay. Are we good? I don't think we can see the screen here. Okay. Great. Well, thank you for that introduction, and it's really humbling to be part of this panel. I'm going to be coming from a slightly different perspective, I think. I'm not a scholar or a historian, although I teach. My work recently has been more focused on practice and specifically sort of recasting the tools of architecture in the service of human rights, fact-finding, and reporting. And I think it's relevant. I mean, I should put into my bio that I was a student at the Cooper Union in the architecture school, and I consider this very much, consider myself a product of the avant-garde in architecture and part of this lineage of thinking and questioning deeply what architecture is. And maybe I'd like you to keep that in mind as I sort of move through this presentation, which is going to focus on a project called Crime Scene Bucha. This project started in collaboration with the Associated Press and Frontline, who wanted to do something about what happened in March 22 in Bucha. And to begin with, we worked, I went back and to a conversation I'd been having with an activist, Ukrainian activist and mechanical engineer by training named Evelina Nefertari, who was living in Poland at the time and with whom we had done a bunch of work on the Maidan protests and the suppression of dissent there. What you're looking at is Bucha, which is a suburb northwest of Kyiv, and the red parts, the sort of woven fabric on top of the satellite image are the paths of drones that were that Evelina was overseeing for about 3 weeks following the Russian retreat out of Bucha. So she was in Poland, and she had mobilized a team of drone pilots to document basically the site of a massacre at the scale of an entire city. So 3 pilots flying around the clock for 3 weeks. It was a tremendous effort and far outpaced and surpassed anything the Ukrainian prosecutor's office could do, or the ICC could do, or the UN could do. She just found a way to get it done. That data set, which she made available to us, became the kind of backbone of a story we tried to tell about what happened in Bucha. And for those of you who may not be familiar, Bucha was a sort of stopping point for Russian forces on the way to Kyiv in March 22. And they were there for almost a month. When it became clear they were not going to take the capital, they eventually retreated, but left behind over 400 dead civilians. And so there was evidence everywhere of crimes committed by Russian forces. And this digital model, this 3D data set, which was incredibly robust, almost too robust and too much information, became a way to structure all of the videos, photos, audio recordings, assets that are going to become central to accountability when this, wherever and whenever it becomes possible. In addition to the 3D model, there was a tremendous amount of video footage. So the 3D model had its own sort of technical requirements that we had to sort of move through. We used a lot of gaming technology. The sort of irony of that is not lost on me, that stuff that was built for fantasy is now being reapplied to sort of represent some things that couldn't be more real. In addition, video evidence, the AP reporters were handed a hard drive that had 70,000 pieces of CCTV footage on it, which we then had to comb through and sort of find this kind of needle in a haystack of assets that were particularly relevant to the crimes that were committed. So what you see on the right is how we divided up that data set between the AP, the Frontline, and C2 to just get through what was a deluge of information. And in the process, also just developing systems that became a little bit more intuitive to deal with the video information. I think it's good that there's so much documentation, but it becomes almost prohibitive in some ways. So this tool was something that we built together with them to look at criteria like where you see Russian soldiers, where the images were taken, so we can answer key investigative priorities, like this one. There was the question, a very important question. This was being done partially through the lens of sort of international law. Were the deaths of the civilians, over 450 civilians, was it coordinated? Was there a chain of command it could be traced back to? And so going through all this footage, we looked for sort of key moments where you could see coordination, orders being given and things like that. So this gentleman is gagged, he's bound, he's being walked to the headquarters, the Russian headquarters. And these moments, which were singular among those 70,000 pieces of footage, become absolutely critical evidence in sort of establishing what was called a cleansing operation. That in the audio files, this word cleansing kept coming up. So this goes from being sort of random acts of violence to being a very coordinated, clear distribution of orders to cleanse. Following this, I'm going to play a brief video. It's about 2.5 minutes. All of this material came together in this video. I do need to sort of preface this by saying it's upsetting, it's graphic, but I just wanted to show you how the material came together to try and present evidence of these crimes. So it'll be about 2.5 minutes, and then I'll wrap up at that point.
The Associated Press, Frontline, and C2 Research reviewed hundreds of hours of CCTV footage, intercepts of Russian phone calls, and spoke with survivors and witnesses to show what happened in Bucha and identify who was responsible. To better understand the scale of the atrocities and how the violence unfolded, we built a comprehensive 3D model of Bucha. It was based on data collected by a team of Ukrainian citizen researchers, the Talionis Group. Bucha authorities say they recovered the bodies of more than 450 men, women, and children. Nearly all of them showed signs of violent death. We mapped where the bodies were found. Each beacon represents the location of a victim, and each death a potential war crime. The largest concentration of bodies, nearly 40, was recovered along Yablunska Street, a strategic thoroughfare running east-west in an industrial section of town. We met with survivors and witnesses along Yablunska Street and beyond. Natalia Vlasenko and her family lived just off Yablunska Street. In early March, her 20-year-old grandson, Dima Chapulehin, a store clerk, filmed the Russians arriving from this second-floor terrace.
А він був на другому поверсі, побачив танки, бабушка, танки.
Dima wasn't the only one recording. One private home on Yablunska Street was outfitted with 6 security cameras. Footage from March 3rd shows Ukrainian soldiers trying to hold off the Russian advance before retreating. Soon after, dozens of Russian troops and vehicles marked with V's take over the street and continue to pour in. By March 4th, the occupation of Bucha was nearly complete. That's when the Russians came for Dima.
Просила, щоб вони його не трогали, вони пішли з нами, забрали його. Я держала їх, я больна.
So this project, I think, in thinking about the role of art and design and creativity at moments like this, we mobilized. There was filmmakers, there was computer scientists, there were artists, there were reporters to try and pull all of it together. Because of course this is about Dima's story, but it's also about every other one of those beacons, right? So how to really fully tell the totality of the story and the massacre at its full scale, while also conveying the realities of individual stories, like Dima and his grandmother. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for, I think, for what makes it really palpable what it means to be on the ground and to experience violence and to be thrown into the middle of the war and not have a choice. We are very much behind time and we don't have a lot of time left for our event today. So what I want to do, I just want to pose maybe one question to all of the panelists and then turn over the floor for maybe just a couple of questions to the audience so that we can wrap up still behind time, but hopefully not too late. And so I think the main, and I think this, the last presentation in our panelists really makes it palpable, that experience of violence that Mihaela was talking about, what it means to live somewhere in Ukraine that experiences violence, and then you have to live there, you have to work. If you are an artist, you try to continue producing your art, and then maybe you move away or something else. But then the other issue, the other question is that whether or not we can ignore what is happening there, and whether or not we can go about what we do without expanding our lens, without shifting our focus and including those contexts in how we teach, what we teach, how we research, and how we publish. And so my question to all of the participants here is, what can be done and what should be done in order to de-imperialize that lens here in the West where we work, right? We cannot change that. We cannot do the work that Russians have to do. We cannot do the work that Russia as a society needs to do about its own society, about its own culture. But what can we do here in the West as institutions, as individuals, as organizations, in order to de-imperialize that lens that, as we have seen, continues to exist? Whoever would like to start, please just let me know.
I'll just throw in some ideas.
Okay.
I think so many of my colleagues who are in the field of Russian art, Russian modernism, Russian culture, they enter the field because they fall in love with either the literature or an artist. They find it exciting. The problem is that they stay in that world. That initial excitement is what formulates their entire career thereafter. And looking back, let's say at the last 40, 50 years, it's been a trajectory that is rather isolated and closed in on itself, that begins not to pay attention at all to what's happening in the world. And it shouldn't take a war for us to come out of that cocoon. I think it's important to have passion, for the research that you do. I think it's important to shed new light on the research that you do, but you can't ignore what the nuances are. And there are a great many nuances when it comes to studying the field, studying the area, or calling yourself a specialist in the area. So my hope is that colleagues who are younger than I, who are in the field, are beginning to think about these things, even if it means changing the names of cities. You're always saying Kiev rather than Kyiv. Those seem like silly little steps, but they're very, very important in understanding that there's a nuance there. If you say Kiev, you are putting your own imperialist spin on it that you have been trained to do. If you stop yourself and say Kyiv, then we understand that you're approaching your profession responsibly. I just throw that out there.
Thank you. Maybe Brad, it seems we're dealing with some technical issues again right now, but so maybe Brad, if you would like to.
Yeah, I don't know what's on the screen. I mean, my mind goes towards the mechanisms of accountability that hopefully will one day be the place where the evidence lands. And I think there's a few vectors that are happening in parallel that are potentially problematic from the imperial standpoint. And I think the United States is complicit in certain ways as well. You know, I mean, is it going to be the International Criminal Court where this plays out? Is it going to be right now, the United States Office of Global Criminal Justice is working very closely with the Ukrainian prosecutors, or is it going to be a national court in Ukraine? And I think these are not equal forums, and I think they're all highly politicized in their own ways. But I do believe, and we worked very closely with the prosecutor's office, the Ukrainian prosecutor's office on this case, that it ideally can land in a Ukrainian court. We've been asked to share information with many different parties, and we'll cooperate with whoever needs it. But there seems to be a very, very large difference between the kind of international stage, and particularly the competition, I would say, between the International Criminal Court and the United States with its own geopolitical interests. So, the United States is not absent from the conversation on sort of influence at this moment. And I think at the end of the day, it needs to, hopefully, truth and justice and accountability needs to take place in Ukraine.
Thank you. And of course, that also touches on the point of erasing knowledge, right? Something that Mihail and Tatiana mentioned earlier in terms of investigating what happened for example, in the early Soviet Union in the 20s, the 30s, and then again after World War II, where the archives are not open, for example. As we know, the KGB archives in Russia have never been opened, and so what we could learn from the KGB archives in Ukraine has already shed so much light. So perhaps that's a way for us to transition to Tatiana and Mihail to weigh in on this.
Well, I always say that you can do a very simple thing and a very pleasant thing, actually, to help decolonize, your conscience and Russian imperialism. Read a Ukrainian book, listen to Ukrainian music, Google something about Ukraine. There is much more than you can expect about Ukraine that you can easily find with one click. It's all there, it's all available, it's interesting. I'm sure everyone will find something to fall in love with Ukraine. And, when the victory comes, we'll all welcome you to celebrate together our victory. So yeah, that's simple.
I would agree to follow up on Tatiana as someone who started studying Russian theater and then went to Kiev and fell in love with Ukraine and Ukrainian theater. It can happen to you too, and the world of research awaits you. So for all the students sitting watching this, do exactly what Tatiana says. Google something. Find out something about Ukrainian art or Ukrainian artist. There probably isn't a lot written in English, and that means there's a wide world open for you. I can't tell you how little is written in English on Ukrainian theater. I think I may be one of the only scholars who's not Ukrainian diaspora or Ukrainian who actually works on Ukrainian theater. So please come join me. We would like to have you studying. I would just say as a college professor, I think decoloniality happens as a praxis in the classroom. And it's something that I work on a lot with the Center for Urban History. We're doing an educational project about translating sources, and similar to Oleg's project, Ukrainica, how do we bring more sources available for professors to bring into their classrooms? Because it's really about students. I mean, students learning Soviet history or learning Eastern European history, how do they learn about Ukraine as well? How do we make that more accessible to them? So that's something that I think about a lot. And I will say it's an uphill battle. And I thought maybe we would be further along than we are, because it's about resources, and it's about resources that universities will allocate to professors to create new courses. It's about resources to hire people to teach Ukrainian and not just Russian, right? And it's about universities and big institutions really investing in this conversation as much as we are, and which I have to say, it's really impressive and wonderful that Cooper Union has invited us all to speak, because that doesn't happen everywhere. And so I think it's still a challenge, but we're working on it. And please, for every student in the audience, just look up something about Ukrainian art. You can thank us later.
Thank you so much. And I think what it means right now, so something that Tatiana mentioned, is that kind of gesture of solidarity at this particular time, right? An unprecedented time, a time when so many horrible things are happening to people who have done nothing to deserve it, who have not provoked it in any way, requires unprecedented response. And so that kind of action of opening your mind, of showing your solidarity with the suffering of the people, not just in Ukraine, but also elsewhere, is what is required of all of us as human beings. Let's just collect a couple of questions from the audience in order to wrap up our event today. So if I can, so we have someone with a microphone there. So if you would like to ask a question, please identify yourself. So, and we are asking for questions, not comments, not lectures, nothing like that. One question, and then we'll collect just a couple of them to respond.
Hi, hello, I'm Peter Anker. Some of you may know me from an op-ed I wrote that kind of began this discussion. I'm super happy to see that Cooper Union has, initiated this conversation and invited you on stage. I think it's really wonderful, and I hope Cooper Union will continue doing so, especially helping out with the reconstruction of the city. Now, I have a question. In context of that debate, about 800 scholars or so wrote a letter, open letter, that I assume you guys have read, signed by a host of Cooper Union people, 12 professors from Cooper Union and many others. In that letter, the way I read it, they kind of create a sort of a Moscow-centric, almost celebrational tone around Futumas and the role of Ukrainians in Futumas. So my question is, do you agree with the tone and the message of that letter? Because it's kind of set the agenda for how to understand Soviet architecture and art in at least in American colleges. Thank you.
Thank you. And another one, let's collect them too. Another question, anyone? Please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Anthony Richter. I just had a question about fusing the two of the themes raised, namely about Ukrainian cultural richness and accountability, and to hear some thoughts about the process of documenting and holding accountable the practices of cultural erasure by destruction and pillage of Ukrainian sites, which seems to be part of the program of the war.
Thank you. All right, so who would like to weigh in on any of those questions?
The last part of your question was interesting to me. I think, again, it goes with trying to look a little bit deeper into history. Just this past week, I was listening to a young scholar, who was working on Scythian art, the gold jewelry that was gathered around the Black Sea region, and how so much of it is housed in the Hermitage. And we don't really question, how did it come to be at the Hermitage, right? So that's Russia. Russia has all these riches, right? Well, it was a process of hoarding. And more than that, it was a process of Peter I not only westernizing Russia, but also to demonstrating that they were also Asian, that they had this connection to the Black Sea colonies, that they had this, therefore, by extension, a connection to Greek culture. And I think we have to start reading these myths, these historical myths that are perpetuated by propaganda. I mean, really, really parsing them. Before Russia invaded Ukraine, Putin put out his own history of the relationship between Russians and Ukrainians. Essentially, there was no relationship. He saw them as one. And if you read that, it really has no basis in facts, no basis in history. I think we need to be very, very scrupulous when we teach Russian history to try and understand the motives behind some of these big events, or as art historians, try to really find out the provenance of where the art is coming from. The same thing happened with, again, back to the Scythian art treasures. They looted Melitopol that had a large collection of Scythian gold. And it was done by the Russian soldiers. They were directed to do it, so that the bulk of the treasures that could be found on Ukrainian territory would end up in the center, and hence it could be used to promote Russian culture overall. I just don't want to, I forgot the first part of the question, sorry. So
that's okay. We have more panelists to respond to and very little time, so that works.
No, I mean, I just, as you were speaking, it just reminds me of how important the role of art historians and historians are at this particular moment to track and make sense of what's being destroyed, because I think the destruction of cultural heritage is a war crime. Erasure of identity is a part of the definition of genocide, and I think knowing when Mariupol is completely leveled, and knowing the theater, for example, that I think Tatiana showed in her presentation, may have an outsized importance in terms of accountability in international law, and so I think the role of historians and artists and art historians at this moment, making sense not just of the destruction, but the legal strategies moving forward, it becomes incredibly important. So that's just one reflection on that. To Peter's question, I'll be very honest. I am both angry and grateful to you for the letter that you wrote that precipitated everything that came after it. I am completely uninterested in the tone of the letter that was signed by 700 scholars. I think I would advise all students not to lose any more time or sleep or focus on that at this point, and to kind of focus on your work and delight in the opening of the hard work you did with this exhibition. But I'm grateful because I think it put this exhibition in a critical context that was necessary. It forced everyone to step back, and this panel would not have happened without it, and these kind of discussions that expanded the conversation beyond the sort of nominal theme of the exhibition. So I respond with ambivalence, but that is my kind of honest thoughts in response to your question.
Thank you so much. Mihail, Tatiana.
Well, I can just add to what was just said. I think it's if we even think that probably it's the first conversation about Ukrainian arts within the Cooper Union ever, and it happens only because of the Russian exhibition. That actually, gives us a very interesting point of view. I frankly don't think there was enough time to rethink Russian avant-garde since the full-scale invasion started. So for me, I haven't seen the exhibition, unfortunately, but I'm grateful to Oleg for sending me some photographs from the exhibition. I think it's too early to have a kind of balanced view on Russian avant-garde, considering all the context that we have now. But of course, I understand also how much effort the students put there, and it's more about them than the avant-garde. And this is where, kind of I find the compromise. But I think it's time to do a lot of homework to rethink Russian art everywhere. Of course, it should start in Russia, but we all know that it might take a very long time for them to begin this work. So I think it's a common responsibility of all the scholars and institutions to make this a very strict and very direct kind of responsibility of anyone, curators and scholars working with this art, to rethink and decolonize and give it a kind of a proper rethinking.
Thank you.
I'm not sure I can say much more than that. I think that was a great ending. I think we should remember that culture is a front in this war. And as we got from, I think, all of the presentations, culture and politics are intimately connected in this place. They were intimately connected in the Russian Empire. They're connected in the Soviet Union, and they're connected in Russia today. And we just should not be so naive as to think that art is separate. It's not. And so for those of us who study art and take it seriously, we have to take the politics seriously as well. And I think war is a time where sides are chosen, and you have to choose your sides. And choosing sides has consequences, but it's important to make those decisions. So that's
Thank you.
what I have
Thank
to
you
add.
so much. I would like to thank everyone. I would like to thank to Tatiana, because it's deep, far past midnight where she is, when she put her children to bed and decided to dedicate her time to talking to us about this, to Mayhill for putting aside all of the grading of the last weeks of the semester and to join us via Zoom, to Miroslava, who, despite certain hurdles on the path to this event, was able to join us and to participate and to present, and to Brad for his absolutely pioneering work on identifying the victims and the perpetrators of the war crimes in Ukraine. And finally, to the Cooper Union for turning a truly challenging situation, a situation that goes against the grain of how, as we know, art and academia work today and have worked for decades, and making out of it a fantastic opportunity for so many of us to begin a journey of decentering and de-imperializing what has been so centered and so focused on Russia for so many decades. Thank you so much, and I hope that this is just the beginning of a long series of similar and other productive conversations. Thank you.